Howdy, Jacob here. Today I'm going to go over how and more why of screening companies. Okay, so I've gone over three ways of how to value business, and I'm going to go lowest to longest. And so the first is just an arbitrage situation. So right now, I've recently posted a video about Hawaiian Holdings and how there's a possible arbitrage happening where you could buy the company's being bought by Alaska Airlines for $18 a share, and then all their debt, to where you could, in a year, maybe even less, if it goes through, you can get the shares for $18, and they're currently selling for 13. And so if I were to be looking at that arbitrage, there's a lot of things I'd look at. The first is I do my own valuation of the business, because that's going to be your downside risk. The downside is the arbitrage situation falls through. The Alaska Airlines is either not able to purchase them, or the Department of Justice won't let them purchase them. And so then it's going to likely fall to a price that is its intrinsic value. Again, it's a short term, so it could fall to really anything, and they could maybe even go under. But you have to balance out your downside risk with the upside risk, and then assign probabilities based on your research of when, in this example, in the last 20 to 50 years that airlines have been around, when has an acquisition gone through and when has it not gone through, and then read through all of the times it didn't go through, read through all the times it did, what were the deciding factors, and base a confidence level of your confidence of it going through or not, and then assign that to your probability. Assign the probability to your price when you take its intrinsic value, and then the price of the arbitrage taking over. And so if it was 90% going to happen, you do 90% times the $18 a share plus 10% times the intrinsic value. That should be the weight that you'd feel comfortable with. So that's one way, and that's kind of the easiest way. Also, it does take into consideration intrinsic value, which is based on the next two, but that's a quick way. The second way is a net. So a company like Co-Diagnostics, I believe I've gone through before, where you look at their balance sheet, you basically take a consideration of all their assets and all their liabilities, and then you subtract them from each other, and you get a price to book, but it's called a net. And so if I were to only weigh cash and short-term investments, I get 59 million. Let's say inventory is worth one, everything else is worthless. So this is 60 million in what we're calling net assets. So if they were to liquidate everything, let's say they get 60 million. They have 9 million in total liabilities. So 60 minus 9, you get $51 million. And the company's currently selling for 34 million. So that difference there is going to be your ability to, if they were to liquidate today, you would be able to get that excess money. But again, that only happens if they do liquidate. So you also have to check their, unless you were able to buy enough shares to where you could force the company to liquidate, you're also going to have to take into consideration their burn rate. So if they have negative free cash flow or negative earnings, then you have to take out, you have to consider how long it's going to take for the company to burn through the excess cash that gives you your confidence of safety. And so here the safety is 60 minus 9 or 51, and then 51 minus 34 is 17 million. And so this burns over 17 million in a year. So really it's less than a 1-year burn rate. But again, if you could buy the business outright and liquidate everything, or buy enough of the shares and liquidate everything, you'd have a 19 million excess of 34 market cap. So your return would essentially be the 51 over 34 if you were to liquidate everything and sell it off. The last way is the most common way, and this is the way I basically value every single company, but it is good to know the three ways, or it's good to know as many as possible. I know I've read the Poor Man's Charlie's Almanac book, and I know him and Warren Buffett know so many different methods of calculating different companies. I currently just know the three, but I stick with what I know. And the main thing I know is that the company's valuation should be based off of their earnings and free cash flow. And so when you do that, you first have to start with the end in mind, I think. And so for me, when I calculate earnings and free cash flow, what matters is the revenue growth, because I want to see where the company is today, where they're going to be at the end of X years. For me personally, I do 7 years, because in my historical review of history, it seems that in the long 100 years that I've looked at, about every 7 years, the market goes from top to top or bottom to bottom, or the same period to the same period in the cycle. And so the cycles that I've reviewed in the past have been about 7 years. So that's what I do. But whatever you do, you need to see where the company is today and where it's going to be. So you need revenue, I think, is important. I think their margins are important because you base the company off of their present value of earnings and free cash flow. So either you take into consideration their earnings today to their earnings later, or what I just do is revenue today, revenue later, and then take the margin of that revenue later. And then also there's 5 things you can do with the free cash flow, which, I mean, you could just do next year's free cash flow over the next year, but it's not all worth the same. And so if a company buys back shares, I think there's a reason I pull that out. I pull out share repurchases and dividends because you as the shareholder really kind of get that money in essence. Like if a company's stock price is worth 100 and they buy back 2% of shares, it should be worth 1 over 0.98 times 100. It should essentially be worth that. And then in a dividend, you actually get that money. But in acquisitions and reinvestment and debt paydown, the debt paydown, you don't really see that. In your acquisition and your reinvestment number, I just throw that into the revenue change figure because in the past, if you look at historical revenue numbers and year-over-year growth, there is reinvestment and acquisition already in there. And so if you just take the free cash flow of all the future earnings that you put in here, then you'd have to back out from the past what's been reinvestment and what's been acquisition. So to me, that doesn't make sense. And so that's why I just throw it all into the revenue growth figure. I throw acquisition, reinvestment, and organic growth into the revenue growth figure. And then I just pull out share change and I pull out dividend to actually be calculated on a year-over-year basis. And so now that we know what it takes to calculate intrinsic value of free cash flow, then you just go through their income statement, their balance sheet, their cash flow statement to be comfortable with everything, to be able to make those assumptions. And so when I'm screening a company, I literally just look through all the statements I just said. So here's just this is essentially their income statement, has a little bit more information, but we get to see their revenue growth here. And we see that over the last 10 years, they've grown mid to upper single digits. We can see that their gross margins are expanding and growing, and we take that into consideration because we know that over the next 7 years, or in my calculation, I go over the next 7 years, I need their margins, so I need to know how they're performing over the last 10 years to know where I think they're going to go over the next 7 years. And then return on invested capital is important because it shows the money that somebody gets through reinvesting back into the business if they do so reinvest. And then the reason I looked for the reinvestment is for my price to earnings for that terminal value at the end of my period that I'm looking at. What kind of multiple should I be assigning the business? And so that's when return on invested capital is important, but also seeing the company reinvest is very important. And then also the balance sheet doesn't go into the consideration until really the discount rate. And if a company has a lot of debt, then I think you need a lot more discount rate. Or if they have no cash and even a bit of debt, there's a higher chance of them going under, which means you should have a higher discount rate. And so I really think just being able to evaluate a business, no matter who you are, you need to figure out how the business that you're looking at, what makes the most sense to evaluate, what type of method does net make the most sense, present value, free cash flow. In most cases, in my experience, it's been free cash flow. Then you figure out how you calculate the intrinsic value of the company based on free cash flow, and then focus on those metrics. And so for me, again, I focus on revenue change, margin change, share repurchases, and their free cash flow statement, and then use their growth along with their return on invested capital, their consistency. Their terminal value is definitely more story-based than analytically based. And then the discount rate that you're looking for. For me, I usually just do 15. And that's because market history, depending on what decades you're looking at, it's probably 8 to 12% inclusive of dividends. And I just want a premium upon that since I'm buying an individual company and not just the market as a whole. And so I do hope that this has helped a little bit I know I just screened a bunch of companies, but hopefully this gives a little bit more overview of why I do the screenings that I look at, and I do think it's good to screen companies because there's so many out there. You don't want to waste your time on ones that aren't close to a buy point. So thank you.